Welcome back!
Let's continue exploring the events that led to the fall of the Soviet Union and its far-reaching effects on global dynamics. The 1980s were a tumultuous decade for the Soviet Union. While Gorbachev was pushing for reform, the USSR was facing mounting challenges both internally and externally. The ongoing war in Afghanistan, which began in 1979, drained resources and demoralized the Soviet military. The conflict, often referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam, proved to be a costly and unpopular intervention. Internationally, the Soviet economy struggled to keep up with the United States' technological and military advances. One of the most significant examples of this was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, launched by President Ronald Reagan in 1983. While the program itself was never fully realized, it sent a clear message. The US was ready to outspend and out-innovate the Soviet Union in a high-stakes arms race. But as the 1980s wore on, Gorbachev's reforms began to have a ripple effect. The Soviet economy, once based on heavy industry and military production, was being surpassed by consumer-driven growth in the West. Meanwhile, the younger generations in the USSR were increasingly exposed to Western culture through television and media. They were disillusioned with the lack of political freedoms and the stagnation of the economy. At the same time, Eastern European countries were experiencing their own revolutions. In 1989, protests in Poland led to the formation of the first non-communist government in Eastern Europe. This was followed by major uprisings in Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. The most iconic of these events was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, which symbolized the end of Soviet dominance in Europe. The Soviet Union's inability or unwillingness to intervene marked the beginning of the end for the communist regime. By 1990, the Soviet republics were on the brink of independence. Nationalist movements, which had been suppressed for decades, grew louder. Gorbachev attempted to hold the Union together, but his reforms were no longer enough to keep the peace. In 1991, after a failed coup by hardline communists, Gorbachev was effectively sidelined, and Boris Yeltsin emerged as the leader of Russia. The final blow came in December 1991, when the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belavezha Accords, formally dissolving the Soviet Union and establishing the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. The Soviet Union, once a superpower, ceased to exist in a matter of months. This collapse had profound consequences not just for Russia, but for the entire world. The dissolution of the Soviet Union led to a new geopolitical order. The United States emerged as the uncontested global superpower, while Russia faced economic turmoil and political instability. The transition from a centrally planned economy to a market-driven one was chaotic and painful. Many former Soviet republics struggled to establish stable governments and economies. But despite the initial hardships, many former Soviet states eventually embraced democratic reforms and market economies. Countries like the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined NATO and the European Union, signaling their shift toward the West. The fall of the Soviet Union also marked the end of the ideological battle of the Cold War. For decades, the world had been divided between the communist East and the capitalist West. With the collapse of communism in Europe and the former Soviet Union, the United States found itself in an unprecedented position of power and influence. Yet, the legacy of the Soviet Union's collapse continues to shape global politics today. Russia, led by Vladimir Putin since 1999, has sought to reassert itself as a global power, challenging Western influence and striving to reclaim its former sphere of influence. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine are just a few examples of how the tensions of the past continue to affect the present. In conclusion, the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't just the end of an empire, it was the end of an era. It reshaped the global landscape and set the stage for the challenges and opportunities we face today. As we look back on the events that led to the collapse of the USSR, it's clear that the legacy of the Cold War still influences international relations, politics, and security concerns around the world. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. Don't forget to like, share, and comment with your thoughts about this pivotal moment in history.